really excited to bring this trio together. It's actually my first time meeting Dr. Persinger. Brendan and Mandy I've met before. Mandy I actually met at the Science and Non-Duality conference a couple years ago, and the moment she started talking about her work, my jaw dropped, and I was really amazed. Their lab has an incredible history. They've been really working, pushing this frontier, pushing this edge of exploring really what is out of bounds for a lot of scientists, and they've been really major pioneers on that forefront. They've been exploring what different types of religious experience look like in the brain. Dr. Persinger actually is well known for something he created called the God helmet, which is actually a device that you put over your head that uses a small electromagnetic field that can actually, in certain cases, trigger an experience of the divine. And that's just one of really a small fraction of the incredible work that they've done over the years. What we're coming together to talk about today, and I'm going to have them each do a short intro to talk a little bit about their personal work, but what we're coming together to talk about is a topic that is of huge interest to me, and it's really looking at this idea of human connection. And of course, we all know what it feels like to be connected with a person. It's something that's arguably a very fundamental aspect of our human experience. We're all in this room feeling connected in a way right now. And I don't mean anything sort of supernatural. I just mean sitting down and looking a person in the eye and having a sense of connection. And we all know what it feels like to be disconnected with a person, where you don't want to have anything to do with them, or you're in a fight with them or something like that. And these qualities of connection are really integral to our social human experience. And the thing that has been fascinating me is this possibility of actually beginning to understand that quality of connection scientifically. So imagine, for example, if we could begin to look at the relationship between the brain waves of two people that are falling in love, two people that deeply trust each other, two people that are collaborating on a project and are totally synced up and are coming up with idea after idea after idea. So imagine being able to actually understand that in the brain and in the body, but what if you took it a step further? Imagine Facebook is an effort to use technology to connect us socially, but it does so on a massive scale, but also at somewhat superficial scale, right? It's not the kind of connection that we really value in our life. It's not that close, intimate connection that is, really memorable and important to us. What if we could create technology that would actually support and catalyze that deeper sense of connection that is already a human potential? It's something that is already available to us, but something that would make that more accessible in therapy sessions, in group meetings, between Israelis and Palestinians. Like, who knows what the applications could be, right? And so this is, broadly speaking, an area of research that this lab has been looking at, and they have this idea of excess correlation and a particular open source hardware device which they've created to explore this. And it's just, I have so many questions for them, and I imagine that you do too. I think we're in for a real treat. And so with that, I would like to welcome Mandy, Brendan, and Dr. Michael Persinger. And I would love to invite you all three to give a short introduction, and then we can kind of move into some question and answer.
All right, if you don't mind, I can begin.
Please.
Okay. Well, I'm Michael Persinger. Oh, I'm getting a feedback here. Okay, good.
Just mute that for now.
Okay, so I'm Michael Persinger, and I'm attempting to integrate all of the sciences into an understandable concept, literally from A to Z, from astronomy to zoology. And the approach that you've just heard from the Master of Ceremonies, the idea of connectedness, is eminently sensible. There's quantitative evidence for it. There's also very good scientific evidence for it. And I think the critical thing would be if you just take the fact that 7 billion brains are immersed in the Earth's magnetic field. A simple quantification indicates that if the magnetic field connected them all, the change in one brain would be diffused to all the other brains within roughly quantitatively about 6 to 7 minutes. And that can be actually calculated. Now, whether it occurs or not, that's a different story. The other important feature about the human brain and the environment in which we have evolved is the fact that the strength of the magnetic field associated with consciousness is associated with roughly about a 40 hertz, that is a 25 millisecond refresh rate. It's associated with magnetic field strengths are really, really small, about a picotesla, which is a decimal point followed by 11 zeros and a 1. And the Earth is the same thing. If we take a look at the fact that the Earth and around it is the ionosphere, in it is oscillating these resonances produced by the global lightning, which is about 40 cycles per second, the same sort of basic frequency as consciousness itself. And actually the intensity of that strength of field is the same as well. And we have found, Dr. Soroka and his colleagues here have found that if we take an ordinary quantitative EEG of somebody that's a normal person sitting in the laboratory, roughly every 30 seconds for about a half a second, there's a marked coherence between that person's brain and what's occurring in the Schumann resonance, which goes all around the Earth itself. So that suggests that this has always been here, but how do you quantify it? Is there correlational data? Well, I think most of the what's called remote viewing and the psi phenomena that have been sadly dismissed or distanced for years, the idea that people separated at a distance can somehow transiently interconnect, is a phenomenon that's been certainly documented since Gurney's work in the 1880s. And so if you think about it, it makes eminent sense, and it's simple in the sense you have A and B, and something happens to A that produces a change in B, and for a moment they're highly correlated. In fact, that's what we call excess correlation. In other words, they should not be correlated because they're separated at such a great distance. It should be random. But when you have two events correlated in excess way, then of course that suggests a different kind of mechanism is involved. And that's where non-locality comes in. So when we say locality, that means if I pick up my calculator and I drop it, the relationship between stillness and response is very evident. If I chat with my colleagues to the left or the right, you know about the fact there's a mechanism there in the sense that if I say something that influences their brain. But suppose they're separated at tens of thousands of kilometers. How do we explain that? I mean, it's still working the same way in the sense that there's a stimulus, there's a response, they're highly correlated, or I should say they're correlated more than chance. And what we attempted to do was to develop a technology that used what nature does all the time. And we know there's a part of the brain, the right hemisphere, specifically the right temporal parahippocampal region, and two basic frequencies, 7 hertz roughly, and 40 hertz, which reflect what the Earth does anyway. And this kind of frequency and pattern in the brain is associated with memory and consciousness. So what we did is say, all right, let's devise a technique based upon everything we know and see if indeed we can enhance what's already there in all of us in a reliable manner. And that's where the technology comes in for the excess correlation. And that's, I guess, a very quick summary. And I'll let my colleagues chat, and I'll be happy to entertain questions. I assume this is working, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Just muted you.
Was that clear?
Yes, great. So, well, I think we have quite a few. I think we have quite a few questions probably, and are going to want to dive into that. But before we, let's hear a little bit from Mandy and Brendan, and a little bit about kind of your background. I'd love to hear, Mandy, about a little bit about your thesis work, and Brendan about your work with gaming, and how that ties into the, if it, in whichever way it does, to the excess correlation idea.
Okay, so my name is Mandy Scott, and my background's in psychology, and I joined the research group several years ago now, and I began by exploring meditation and remote viewing. And I've always kind of wanted to stay a little bit further away from magnetic field applications because at the time I didn't really quite understand them or appreciate the full complexity and dynamics of the interaction going on with consciousness. I was most enthralled with what we are capable of achieving when we direct our awareness through intentionality, and how we might be able to access non-local information through practices that we can achieve by generating our own unique magnetic field configurations that allow this. So in my master's thesis, I explored whether we could train people to learn how to remote view, and evidently we absolutely can, and it does not require a lot of training. I ran through a few pilot studies before the final study, and it began with many weeks of training, and I finally dwindled it down to just 4 hours. And what I found in the end was that it was in interaction with the Earth's geomagnetic field when the conditions were quiet, less stormy, combined with more experience with the task, so just exposure to the task and having had practice with it, the greater the accuracy scores, as rated by independent judges not involved in the study. So through this process, I've continued to explore the quantitative electroencephalographic profiles, the brainwave patterns associated with these non-local and non-dual states of consciousness, so these self-transcendent states that we can enter through meditation and creative states, flow states. And now, so for my doctoral thesis, I'm currently in an interdisciplinary PhD program called Human Studies, and the goal is really just, if you can explore human behavior and processes in a way that combines different disciplines, you can explore anything. So I've partnered up with Professor Patrick Palucki. He's an artist and consciousness researcher from Berlin, Germany. And we are creating a novel neurofeedback paradigm. It's a hybrid brain-computer interface system. We call it My Headquarters. We'll be showing this work at the Tucson conference in later this month, the Science of Consciousness conference. And we first demonstrated it at the Transformative Technology Conference in Palo Alto this past fall, and that was a lot of fun. So onward in explorations, but along the way, I couldn't help but throw myself into finally really providing some major evidence. When we take ourselves to these distances that exceed 6,000 kilometers, that was the distance between Sudbury and the different locations throughout Europe that we took these measurements in last summer, I had to be a part of that. So that was a lot of fun. That was my first time exploring magnetic field applications in my own work.
Cool. So great. And I want Brendan, before we dive in, I want to kind of like ground ourselves a little bit in some of the concepts that are floating, because I think a lot of this information is new in a lot of the work that you all have been doing is new for a lot of people. So I want to make sure that things are clear. So there's a few really interesting and really unconventional ideas that we're hearing, right? One of them is around this this capacity for people to be measurably connected in a way over a long distance, right? Which is what you're referring to as this non-locality or non-local effect. And of course, we're used to that idea with a phone or something like that, but what you're proposing is actually that there may be measurable ways in which, without using a cell phone or Skype or something, that people's brains might actually be measurably connected over a long distance.
May I answer that?
Yes, please.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the difference between a telephone or a Skype is that there's a medium in between. Either there's a wire or wireless, or there's electromagnetic field or whatever. In the case of non-locality and excess correlation, there's no obvious medium. There's no electromagnetic generation. I guess the best way to describe it is the experiment we did with Dr. Dowd and I did a few years ago. We have a photon reaction here and a photon reaction here. We inject a small amount of chemical to get a photon reaction. If, for example, we have these two vials in the same circular magnetic field, and there's technical reasons for doing that. It's got to be very specific. It's got to imitate effectively what the proton electron does. But if they're rotating the same way, what it does, for all practical purposes, is it juxtaposes the two separate spaces as if they were one space. So it's not like you're communicating across. What you're doing is you're superimposing the two spaces. How do we know that? Because when this occurred, it was equivalent. When these photon emissions occurred, if we injected simultaneously with these rotating fields, it was as if both were simultaneously superimposed, and so the photon emission doubled. And when we look at the brain that my young colleagues did last summer so effectively, if you look at the quantitative EEG work, it's almost as if the two brains, even though they were separated by thousands of kilometers, were superimposed transiently and were actually the same brain for a brief period of time.
So really interesting. So now, Brendan, just we'll get to you in one sec because I want to kind of lay a little foundation. So now, in order to explore or to support the exploration of this idea of brains being connected over long distances in this way, you've created an actual hardware device which is available as an open source hardware project that actually allows anyone, anywhere, to essentially build their own version of it and to run the experiment themselves. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And so, can you talk about, just so we're clear, like what is that device? What does it look like? What would it be like? Can you kind of give us, like, maybe paint the picture? What would it be like if you and I were going to use the device? What would happen?
Okay. Well,
I could try, sure.
Sure, go ahead.
So the device starts with a crochet ring that just gets the 10-inch diameter that's optimal to fit on an average head, and then you wire wrap that ring with a 16 gauge lamp cord, and it creates a toroid that directs the magnetic fields at the cortex. So it makes an easy way to apply the fields to the head in a way that's easily modulatable, I guess. And that connects to a Arduino microcontroller, and you can program in your own fields. And we provide the ones that generate our effect optimally with a primer and an effector field, they're called. And that's pretty simple, I think.
Well, okay, and a very splendid description of it. The theory behind it took a long time, not to mention the empirical work. Effectively, we chose the circle because technically something in a circle is always accelerating, theoretically, in terms of the technical. We spent a lot of time figuring out what that rotational speed should be.
Get to do that.
I'll do my part
Go ahead.
while they work fixing
Sure.
it. I'm Brendan, hi. I work with video games in the lab, talking about consciousness and brain activation. My studies include explorations into immersive video games and the flow state with respect to using EEG and how immersive games relate to states of consciousness. And with those studies, we find that the areas of the brain that are active during states of flow in video game play are the same areas of the brain that are active, that keeping track of your physical body's position in space, the right parietal lobe, together with the frontal lobe as well, which is an interesting finding in that as you sit in the chair with the controller in your hand, your brain is attending to the digital character as if it was your own, which is interesting for perceptions of the body and perceptions of the sense of self. So we took that research and applied that with the excess correlation technology and tried to see how we could play with those and modulate the sense of self and the skill of a gamer in the game space with the excess correlation tech. And what the study included having a novice game player and an experienced game player sharing a space with the toroid setups, and we found that the novice players who played the game paired to an experienced player learned the game faster than a novice players playing on their own outside of the fields. So it's been replicated since as well. So we're excited about that one. The fact that the energy of a learned action can follow a kind of energy gradient. It's a metaphor I like to use to describe it in helping superimpose the brain spaces and allowing this an equilibrium to be made in how someone may learn something. And the implications of that are far and wide, I think, and there are exciting things to test out. So that's some examples of the ways the technology can be used. And I guess it's...
So we have a question here about the player experiment. Did you control for placebo?
Yes, we did. We had novices play the game. We had novices... we had them open up a Word document, and people who engaged in the study and third-party people just as controls, and had them do just type at the computer just to get brain activation there. And so I think that covered the placebo. I think.
Well, in addition to that, if you have individuals who are both experienced players, you did not get the same effect.
Right.
And our idea was very much like receptors and ligands in neuropharmacology. If you have a chemical that's very, very close to the ligand, that is to the chemical that should be sequestered at the receptor, it can interfere with it or block it. So in the case of this experiment, the novices were facilitated, but two individuals with similar game experience, there seem to be inhibitory effects, which would be what you would expect if you're dealing with a similar mechanism. In other words, the same mechanism that's involved with the entanglement process or excessive correlation process is the same thing that's involved with his ability to mutually engage in game playing. So, so in many respects, it was even more effective than a placebo control.
I see a question. Was there an effect with two novices hooked up? There was no effect. They learned the same speed as the novices with no fields.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
We find that if there's some anastropy, that is unequal information on one side to the other side of the two people that are connected, the question we're asking right now and looking at right now is it downloaded or uploaded? I mean, to use a metaphor. But there has to be some degree of gradient. And also the phenomena have to be changing. That's really important. There has to be a changing phenomena for it to be transmitted. Static phenomena do not seem to be transmitted.
Mm-hmm.
That's a good point to mention their next question. Can you talk about exactly what the coils are doing? Frequency, pattern, part of the brain function, and you just mentioned that it has to be constantly changing, and that's exactly what our patterns are doing.
Yes. So basically, what the toroid does, the point duration is about 3 milliseconds. That is how each of these components that are generating the field, about 3 milliseconds. 3 milliseconds is important because that's tied to a number of features we've shown. For example, proton activity in the brain. The same thing controls pH, and basically all brain activity is tied to pH, just the balance of small balances of acid and bases on the inside and the outside of the plasma membrane. So I think the critical thing is that spinning around has to overlap, and it does overlap with the theta activity that's generated from the brain itself. And not all the brain is influenced. The right hemisphere, and we've been looking at this for quite a while now, a lot of our colleagues here, there's something unusual about the human being's right parahippocampal region. That's in the right temporal lobe of the ventral surface. It's really different. It seems to be highly correlated with and coherent with the Earth's magnetic field. Not just our research, but even some of the NASA, including the Russian Soviet work, showed this. And this is the actual source of the 7 to 8 hertz pulsing. There are small cells in the entorhinal cortex, which is a part of that parahippocampal gyrus, that generates 7 to 8 hertz all the time. And that seems to be an important component for, one, the interacting with the magnetic fields we apply at that right frequency going around, but also to interact with the Earth's magnetic field.
So they write, what does overlap with the cell activity mean? And I think he was asked that question while you were saying 3 milliseconds is an important duration.
Overlapping with cell activity, first of all, is not just one thing, but by overlapping with cell activity, first of all, if you're going to get to an aggregate of neurons, you have to find a way in like a key. The key is the proton. And the proton is basically what allows pH to change. Protons are in water. All the ions that move in and out of a cell are following water molecules. So you need to have it resonating with that. Then on top of that, you have to be able to interact with the aggregate. And the aggregate cells that seem to be so important are all pulsing roughly around 7 to 8 hertz. And that's because in the human brain, there's a built-in pacemaker around 7 to 8 hertz in the entorhinal cortex, particularly the right side, and these cells just pulse all the time. And if you have your applied field synchronized just right, then you have 2 different people in 2 different places with that same synchrony, then you can create the conditions for excess correlation.
Next question, can you talk about the subjective aspects of this? What would it feel like for 2 people to be connected? What type of felt experiences do you imagine could be catalyzed through such a tool?
Well, I'll answer that, and then you guys can answer this, because this is why we ask for the world's assistance and contribution, and actually co-authorship in large part to this thing, is that we know how it works in the brain, but in large part the experiences that people have are going to be only monitored by themselves. And so in terms of the part of the brain that's activated, it's going to be related to time, space, emotion, feeling. It'll probably be very picture-based because it's right hemispheric. It'll probably be just knowing something without necessarily knowing why you know the details. But that's why it's so important for this approach to be replicated by as many different people as possible. That's why we put the software and the hardware in the hands of basically the world.
The imagery is really interesting that people experience through this, and it is a sense of interconnectedness. So I've participated in the paradigm myself and have been paired with others, usually people I know, just as we're testing the equipment. And also those who I've spoken to following the experience, I interview them briefly and get them to fill out a questionnaire about their mood, and also to answer questions about any imagery that emerged during the experience. And many of the individuals describe this sense of openness, and especially as we get into the effector period of the field condition, where we find the strongest effects in coherence between the 2 brains separated by the great distance. During that time, they feel so these are, of course, just verbal behaviors. They're descriptions of their individual experiences, but what they do describe is this sense of interconnectedness, the sense of becoming one with the space, and often it is, if in certain paradigms that we use, we also involve a sending and receiving visualization condition. And during these conditions, participants report really perceiving this sending and receiving of energy to be much stronger, especially during that effector period. Mm-hmm. So what do you find?
Yeah, in some of our other work with games, We've tried players who played cooperative action games.
Oh, they said check our speakers
Check our speakers.
to make sure it's on. Is there anything here?
Yep, we're on.
We're on. Okay.
Okay.
So
So I'll get to that question, Caleb's question, after I talk about this.
Right.
So what we found with pairing gamers playing cooperatively was that there's subjective reports of them feeling like they had a sixth sense to what the other player was doing. They felt like they knew that the other player was doing what they should, and you get that when optimally when both players are in a flow state. So it was really interesting to hear that you just kind of became one with the other player and had this inherent trust that they were doing what they needed to be doing and to complete objectives or whatever they were doing. And if you feel that as well in meditation paradigms, there's reports that there's sharing of lights and reports of sensations that the other participant then says that they also had with sometimes there's a bit of analytical overlay on it with people labeling things how they would to themselves with how they perceived it, but you get patterns and features of the physical space as well, picking up on other people's sensations of their environment. So there's lots of nuance to play with it, and
Yeah.
as Dr. Persinger mentioned, the most important thing is getting it out there and getting people to try it, so we can, and getting online and collaborating on discussing about how it can be used and what kind of experiences we can get out of it, because it's really unlimited, really, and we just need to try. Yeah.
The real life, that's true.
Yeah.
So Sai is asking, have you hypothesized what may be the conduit between the two users? So I guess it's back to you.
Yeah, the conduit, think of it this way. There are two ways of looking at phenomenon, causality and correlation. And most causality phenomena require a medium. I mean, for example, light transmission, you can calculate the speed of light by just knowing the magnetic permeability and the permittivity. So there has to be a medium. The difference about excess correlation is that there's no medium in the technical sense. That's why it's such a challenge. And things are connected simply because of the nature of the space and the patterns that are involved with it. So in this instance, the critical feature is producing the optimal electromagnetic field conditions in the two places. And I think the most appropriate metaphor is that the two places simply become superimposed. So there's no real transmission in that respect. I know people find that entanglement and excess correlation and all of those interesting tasks seem to be contradictory, though the famous spooky things that takes place at a distance. But we're understanding more and more that to understand it effectively, you have to look at basically the universe as a whole and space and time as a whole. And then these kind of contradictions are no longer as challenging as they seem to be. And I know I may be sounding obtuse, but to say it any other way would require me to go to the blackboard and do some calculations. So I'm going to try to keep it verbal. The other feature too is it works. That's the critical thing. And it has to do with precise timing. You can't interfere with it. When Ingo Swann was here, the great remote viewer, we applied a similar technology, a more primitive one, and we actually enhanced its ability to do remarkable remote viewing, but we also could block it if the timing wasn't precise.
And
Okay.
I'll jump in. I skipped Caleb's question, sorry. The effects on experts, it was the expert condition were insignificant difference from experts playing with no fields. So no interference, just it's more or less as if nothing happened, because the brain space was equal in their expertness in their skill level. And so yeah, there's no difference there. So it seemed to just get you what you want.
Okay, and to George Burke, that's why we need everybody to collaborate on this process so that we have more people experimenting with this phenomenon. But it looks like they want to try to reconnect.
Okay.
So we should try that.
I'm going to do a
So
little
we're gonna-
refresh and then try to connect. Yeah.
So we're going to take a couple questions from the audience. Okay. Let's, where did our microphone go?
Science is based upon three basic features. One,
Check.
observation. Secondly, measurement. And third, inter-observer agreement. That's why, as my colleagues and I have been saying, it's so important for as many people as possible to build the equipment and try it out for themselves to see what they experience. What my two young colleagues just mentioned to you in terms of the experiences, the subjective experiences that people report, it's consistent with the idea that this technology takes people in two different loci and superimposes them as if they're in the same locus, the same space. And that's a completely different kind of interaction. It's a non-locality in large respect than the idea of having something transmitting, be it by wireless or by a wire.
Okay, we have thank you, Dr. Persinger. We have a question from the audience.
Are you able to hear me?
Yes.
Great. I'm curious about the structure of the signals going to or from this circle. Is it the same signal going to both of the circles in synchrony? That's the first part. Second is, what's the structure of it? Is it pulses or is it continuous waveforms?
You're going to have to repeat it for me.
I can repeat it for you.
Leo,
Okay.
can we turn this microphone up?
Okay, I'm curious about the waveforms that are being sent or received from the circles. Is it
Right.
Is it just an identical signal going to the two circles?
First of all, for the two circles, it's the same signal. Secondly, the signal is not symmetrical. Symmetrical signals like sine waves don't work. These are frequency or phase modulated signals which effectively change from about 6 hertz to about 20 hertz in terms of phase shifting or frequency shifting. And they are the same ones presented to both circles, of course, each circle being worn by a different person.
Thank you.
And so, just to be clear, are you, for the two circles that are located in these different locations, is it the exact same thing happening at the same circle at the same time, at the two circles at the same time?
Within the realm, and because of the way the timing works in the computers, they may be slightly out of phase, but that may be less of an issue considering the fact that the brain's refresh time is about 20 millisecond increments. So they could be off by a millisecond one way or the other, but the brain tends to chunk information in 20 millisecond chunks for consciousness, a bit longer for what we call now. Now is roughly maybe 35, 40 milliseconds. So even though they may be slightly out of whack in terms of out of lag for electronically, the brain's a pretty wide chunking system for time.
Yes, we have another question from the audience.
It sounds like this device works at a distance, non-locally. Is there a concern if crowding the airspace, so to speak, let's say there's 1 million people doing this, how does one brain connect to another brain and not get sabotaged by other people wearing the same devices using the same frequencies?
Splendid question. In fact, my suspicion is, as in fact the Master of Ceremonies, Dr. Mikey, said earlier that we're all connected. We are probably all connected in a very weak statistical way. My suspicion is, from the history of science, is that there are these special conditions that occur during dreams, particularly for people who have shared reinforcement histories. That's why psi phenomena tends to occur between people who have emotional connection. But most of the time, the interconnection is really low level. So what we've done here with this technology is basically boost the signal. So if somebody else could boost the signal in a comparable way to what the equipment does, then it could be a 3-brain interaction or a 4-brain interaction. You're totally correct.
And the idea of having more than two pairings as well, as long as the fields are presented simultaneously. The idea that you could have 3 or 4 toroids in one session, I guess, to do a group meditation or a group synchronization is something we're testing in the lab and is promising so far. And
Yeah.
and having a way to algorithmically generate field patterns is something we're working on as well, to make sure that there isn't crosstalk in the off chance that more than one pairing activates within 20 milliseconds of each other.
Yeah, in addition to that, I mean, if indeed the metaphor, which seems to be supported by the data, is correct, that you're superimposing two loci, you're superimposing two brains, that both of them are virtually superimposed for a brief amount of time. It's like a Zeeman effect. I mean, the split is critical, but if you start to superimpose a lot, that's an interesting question in terms of how discernible would the information be, or it would be like sort of a kaleidoscope of multiple imagery. So that's a question that has to be answered.
Mm-hmm. You're very early still.
Yeah.
Could you paint another picture? Tell us a story. Imagining that we had a stadium full of people, all wearing this device, all experiencing the same frequency, the same pulse pattern at the same time. What might that feel like experientially if you were to really kind of let loose and unbuckle your belt and really like project and imagine like what could this look like in the sci-fi future? What do you foresee?
Well, I can chat, and then my colleagues will have some ideas too. I suspect if we had an entire stadium full of people wearing the same equipment with the same patterns, I would expect from the biophysics behind it, an emergent property, something that emerges that's beyond the 1,000, 10,000 people that are making, something that reflects the average of everybody. In other words, if you take 10,000 copper wires and you apply a magnetic field to them, you get a current in them, that's true. But then there's going to be a field generator around them which reflects the constituents, the 10,000 constituents, which will be a field with its own characteristics. So a kind of an emergent field would take place. I'm not saying like a super consciousness or that kind of extreme, but you can't exclude the possibility, but it would reflect the average of everybody. What the average brain is doing at the time could be even more powerfully displayed as an emergent property.
And what do you think that would actually feel like from a subjective, phenomenological kind of view?
Well, I can tell you that from the basis of our God helmet studies, I think people would have a spiritual experience because they would feel connectedness that would be something they cannot obtain with themselves or in a small group. That would be my hypothesis.
And we do kind of get a taste of this when we already immerse ourselves in the field of the stadium's environment. You're getting into the hive mind sort of framework where you're at a collective singular event. All the intention and awareness is focused on the field. And so we do get those like naturally occurring spontaneous synchronizations. But through this method, certainly you can enhance the signal and enhance that experience.
And in my perspective, in the distant side sci-fi future, I get a lot of flack for this one, but I think that this technology has the potential to make the internet obsolete. If we can all, if there's algorithms to access particular points of information, as long as that information has something rotating, a magnetic field rotating around it, it could be accessed at any time from any place. And I think that it would just have that information suddenly accessible to your brain at all times, whether it's information or emotions or any just communication, sending a thought text to somebody, imagination can go wild. So I think it could go there if it's done properly and stays out of the wrong hands.
If I can just add I would agree totally. The basic physics behind it would be, we already know that the primary strength of magnetic fields associated with consciousness is about a picotesla, 10 to minus 12 Tesla. A millivolt per meter roughly is the electrical potential. And even the frequency and the phase shifting is identical, I mean identical, to what happens anyway between the Earth's surface and the ionosphere around it, that cavity called the Schumann resonance cavity. And if you could access that, I'm not sure it'd be the Akashic record, but if you could access that, there's no stopping it. Because once you're in that spherical waveguide, you're anywhere on the Earth.
We have a question from the audience here. Glenn? You want to just come up right next to the thing? It's probably the easiest thing.
Hi. When trying to synchronize photons, say in a free electron laser, the hard part is not to get all the electrons to give up a photon, but to get to do it in phase. And so
Right.
if you had a stadium full of people, as you say, they all come online, but they interfere, and some constructively, some destructively, and so it's not clear to me that getting a stadium full of people isn't just going to average out to one person, as opposed to being coherent and integrated. So how do you propose establishing a coherent communication as opposed to multi-person where they can destructively add or subtract from each other?
Splendid question. Well, I'm not sure that it would be like a laser with coherence. For example, we measure photon emission from the brain, and we measured it when people are thinking, engaging in imagination. We published that in Neuroscience Letters a few years ago. And we've been measuring, like many other of my colleagues throughout the world, measuring photon emissions off of cells. And cells will become coherent. Even though, for example, we measure, let's say, roughly 1 million melanoma cells in a dish, and they do show a coherent effect. And more evidence indicates that there's some biological mechanism that allows a coherence. And my guess would be, to answer that nice technical question, it's the spectral power density, the actual spectral power density of all the photons coming off, and that amplitude modulation that is the information. So it's not so much that all the photons are parallel or synchronized. The energy that they are interfering with, or something equivalent, the spectral photon density, that's the critical variable. And that seems to be the information, at least that cells use, even though they may be on the other side of an organ, which we measure directly. Does that help any? Hi.
My question is, how do we discriminate consciousness? If we don't want the average consciousness, and we wanted to just get the higher consciousness to use information to probably save the world, how would we do that?
So you want to amplify your own personal consciousness and move. Well, I think the critical feature to this higher consciousness, first of all, we have to empirically define and measure, or at least have some quantification of what higher consciousness is. If higher consciousness is being more and more like the Earth itself, let me get the feedback out of the way, thank you. If indeed higher consciousness is being more and more like the Earth itself, which is that Schumann resonance, that pattern has been there certainly since abiogenesis, when life was first created. If that's the idea of higher consciousness, then, well, the more you synchronize with that, the higher it will be, the more you will be at one with that particular level of functioning. If higher consciousness is something more cosmic at a universal level, which we now realize involves energy levels in the order of about 10 to minus 20th joules, which is just at the threshold of all kinds of really interesting things, throughout the universe. Then, of course, the closer you get to that, the more your experience would be like the whole. So I guess the short end of that would be, if indeed what you call higher consciousness is limited to the Earth itself, then the more we imitate what that Schumann resonance and all of its characteristics are like, the more you'll be like what that is, which basically engulfs all of us all the time, and certainly was present, as far as we know, when when life was first formed. In fact, experiments have indicated when you put a lightning strike through primitive atmospheric gases, you get amino acids. If you add the Schumann resonance, the amino acids start to sequester together to form proteins, which is the first step of life.
So we're gonna have to be closing up now. So I have a sort of a final question that I'd love to hear from all of you, just a sort of a kind of a brief answer. You have this project which is backed by many years of research, and you have this sort of open source project which is now available for other people to try to replicate. And there seems to be this effort to really deeply explore this and to kind of get it out into the world. If you were to imagine that your work was extraordinarily successful beyond your wildest dreams, and this was, the science was deeply and profoundly understood, and maybe this was in the hands of many people, what impact do you hope that this would have really in the big picture? What impact do you hope that this would have on the world?
If I can start with that, and then my colleagues, if you don't mind. First of all, 3 things: no more secrets, equity between all human beings, and an understanding of human consciousness that will allow us to then move forward beyond some of the petty features that keeps human beings tribalized and unfortunately in a state of a kind of individual islands. That would be the goal. You want to hit that?
Yeah, I can't put it any better than that.
That's a really great potential outcome for sure.
Cool. Well, thank you all. Oh, did you guys want to have, Mandy and Brendan, did you want to add your own response to that?
I mean, just having, if it can help people be more empathetic towards one another, I think that's worth it in and of itself.
I think, yeah, as the greater empathy that people are able to experience, the greater compassion that we can have. And as a result, all of these great ideas that Dr. P presented would be surely possible.
I had a dream when I was your age, Mikey, long ago in a galaxy far, far away. And that was, suppose everyone was connected, such that you felt the pain in your stomach when you couldn't eat, such as in Biafra. Suppose we were all connected and you felt that hot bullet pierce your skin in South Vietnam. Would there be war and would there be famine? And the answer is no, there would not. But the problem is, in the past, we were never connected. We were 7 billion separate brains. Now we have an opportunity to have an interaction that may allow us to have a bit of these shared experiences. And if it's optimal, then those conditions that have been so devastating to our species could be at least minimized.
And with that, thank you very, very much, Brendan and Mandy and Dr. Persinger.